The glass of water was still full when she opened her eyes, sitting exactly where a careful hand had placed it, on the small table beside a bed she did not remember climbing into, in an apartment that smelled faintly of coffee grounds and crayons. And for 3 full seconds Brooke Harrison did not know where she was, only that the sheets were not hers, the ceiling was not hers, and somewhere beyond the door a small voice was asking someone named Daddy if they were going to be late again. She sat up too fast. Her shoes were lined up neatly by the door, heel to toe, the way her father used to line up his own shoes every night of his life. Her blazer was folded over a chair, not draped, folded, the way you fold something you respect. And on the nightstand, beside the water, a single folded note in handwriting that slanted hard to the right. Cab is paid for. Fridge has breakfast if you want it. No rush. She read it twice before the second, more urgent thought arrived. The one that made her stomach drop the way it hadn't dropped in years. Nothing had happened. She knew that the way you know your own name. Nothing had happened, and somehow that was the thing that frightened her most. Because it meant she had been fully seen, fully vulnerable, and fully safe, all at once, by a man whose full name she realized, sitting there in his daughter's borrowed guest room with her hair still smelling of last night's whiskey, she did not actually know. To find out how a woman who had spent 9 years building a wall around herself ended up waking up safe in a stranger's home, and why, unlike everyone else in her life, he never once tried to use it against her, stay until the very end. If stories like this one, about people who are quietly better than the world gives them credit for, mean something to you, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. So many of you watching have lived some version of this, on one side of it or the other. And here's something worth sitting with before we go back to where it all began. There's an old argument that never quite dies, about whether the people who build a company are the ones who get remembered by it, or whether that credit always drifts upward to whoever's names is already on the door. Keep that question in your pocket. It matters more than you'll expect. 11 months earlier, none of this existed. Brooke Harrison was, by any external measure, exactly what she appeared to be. The 4th-generation CEO of Harrison Regional Freight, a $210 million logistics company. Her great-grandfather had started with 3 trucks and a handshake, and which she had spent the last 6 years since her father's death defending from a slow, grinding erosion of margins, a board that had grown impatient, and a pending contract with a national retail chain that, if it fell through, would cost the company $41 million. And, by her own private calculation, around 300 jobs. She ran the company the way she ran everything, alone, immaculately, and without visible cracks. She arrived first and left last. She did not cry in front of staff. She had not, in fact, cried in front of anyone since the morning of her father's funeral, when she had allowed herself exactly 4 minutes in a stairwell, before fixing her makeup and walking back out to shake 200 hands. Grant Sullivan had worked in the Maintenance and Facilities Division of Harrison Regional Freight for 2 years, 4 months, and, though he never said it aloud to anyone, an easy way of tallying that had become a private, almost meditative habit, because it was roughly how long it had been since his wife, Danielle, had died of a sudden cardiac event at 34, leaving him with Lucy, then 5, and a silence in the house so total that for the first few months he'd left the television on overnight just to hear a human voice. Before the maintenance job, before any of it, Grant had spent 11 years as a senior structural engineer at a firm 2 states over. The kind of engineer whose name went on stress reports that other engineers built entire bridges around until a single beam calculation on a warehouse expansion project was quietly altered after his sign-off by a colleague eager to hit a deadline. A beam that failed under load 8 months later, injuring 3 workers, and a company that needed a name to attach to the failure before its own liability insurance renewed. Grant had the documentation. He had the original file, time-stamped, showing his numbers were correct. He had also had, at the time, a 4-year-old daughter with no living mother and a mortgage he could not survive losing a wrongful termination lawsuit over while unemployed. And so when the firm offered him a severance package contingent on his silence, and a letter that simply said resigned, he had signed it, packed Lucy's lunch the next morning, and never spoken of it again. He told himself the buildings were still standing. He told himself Lucy would never have to know her father had a name once and lost it. That was the only ledger he kept. The villain of this particular chapter, though nobody in the building would have called him that, was Marcus Feld, Senior Vice President of Operations, the very man whose altered beam calculation had ended Grant's engineering career 2 states and 1 lifetime ago, and who had, in one of the small cruelties fate seems to specialize in, been hired by Harrison Regional 18 months after Grant, entirely unaware, or so it seemed, that the quiet maintenance technician who fixed the loading dock sensors was the same man whose signature he'd once erased from a file. Marcus was polished in the particular way certain men become polished, all firm handshakes and phrases like, "let's circle back," and "at the end of the day." And he had spent the better part of a year positioning himself as indispensable to Brooke, the only executive who seemed to anticipate her needs before she voiced them, the one who always had the numbers ready, the one the board liked. Nobody built empires out of malice alone. Marcus built his out of the simple, patient exploitation of being underestimated in exactly the opposite direction Grant was. Nobody suspected the well-dressed man in the boardroom, because well-dressed men in boardrooms are never the ones you're taught to watch. The company's celebration that would change everything was, on its surface, nothing more than what the internal calendar called Founders' Evening, an annual gathering held every year on the anniversary of Brooke's father's birthday, a tradition she had never once canceled, not even the year of his funeral, not even the year revenue dropped 9%, because some part of her needed the building to remember him, even if the industry had already started to forget the man who founded it. She always gave a short toast. She always kept it composed. Nobody but her own reflection ever saw what the anniversary actually cost her. The particular grief that has nowhere to go, because it isn't allowed a private day, only a public one, dressed up as celebration, catered, and photographed. This year, with the retail contract hanging over the company like a held breath, with Marcus Feld hovering at her elbow all evening, reassuring her the numbers would work out, with 200 employees watching her, the way employees watch a captain during a storm, Brooke Harrison, for the first time in 6 years, let the wine keep coming instead of stopping herself at 2 glasses the way she always did. Nobody at Harrison Regional Freight had ever seen her have a 4th. Nobody had ever seen her have a 5th. By the time Grant Sullivan noticed her sitting alone at the edge of the room, her toast already given, her composure already starting to slip at the corners like a seam under too much weight, most of the executive staff had already begun drifting toward the valet line, more concerned with their own exits than with a CEO who suddenly looked, for the first time any of them could remember, breakable. 8 months would pass before anyone in that building understood what actually happened after the party ended that night. But the quiet cost of it had already started, silently. The very next morning, the breaking point when it came for Grant arrived not as a dramatic confrontation but as a quiet bureaucratic erasure, delivered in a fluorescent-lit conference room on a Tuesday morning 11 days after Founders' Evening, when Marcus Feld, flanked by a compliance officer and a printed incident report, informed Grant that an anonymous complaint had been filed alleging he'd used his after-hours access badge to enter an executive's private residence without authorization. Marcus said the words policy violation 4 times in 90 seconds. He said optics twice. He never once asked Grant why he'd been at Brooke Harrison's apartment at 11:40 that night. And Grant, true to the only rule he had ever set for himself since Lucy was 5 years old, protect her, say nothing that could cost her a roof, did not offer an explanation either, because the truth, that he'd driven the visibly intoxicated CEO home in her own car, after the valet refused to let her drive, walked her up 3 flights because the elevator was down for maintenance, set her down safely, left a glass of water and a note, and left before anything could be misread by anyone, including her, sounded to his own ears exactly like something a man says right before nobody believes him. He had learned that lesson once already, in another building, with another set of altered numbers. He was not eager to relearn it. What none of them knew, Marcus, not the compliance officer, not even Grant himself in that moment, was that the anonymous complaint had originated from Marcus's own assistant, prompted by Marcus, who had recognized Grant's face 3 weeks into his own employment at Harrison Regional and spent the better part of a year in quiet, low-simmering anxiety that the man from the maintenance closet might someday remember his own name well enough to say it out loud in the wrong room. A whisper about a night at the CEO's apartment was, to Marcus, a gift too perfect to ignore, a chance to remove Grant permanently, cleanly, and with the company's own compliance office doing the work for him, before Grant ever had reason to bring up an 8-year-old beam calculation to anyone who mattered. Grant was placed on unpaid leave that afternoon pending review, and by Friday, without ever being given the chance to explain himself to the one person who actually knew the truth of what happened, he was quietly let go, his badge deactivated, his locker cleared into a cardboard box by facility staff who wouldn't meet his eyes, a severance check mailed rather than handed to him, as though the company were embarrassed to look at what it was discarding. He did not fight it. He had a mortgage. He had Lucy's second-grade tuition assistance application due at the end of the month. He had, above all, a 7-year-old at home who had already lost one parent and did not need to watch the second one unravel in a lawsuit over a job fixing loading dock sensors. So Grant Sullivan drove home that Friday, picked Lucy up from her after-school program, let her pick the radio station, and said nothing at all about what had happened, the same way he'd said nothing 8 years earlier, filing the injustice away in the only place he'd ever learned to put it. The part of himself that stayed quiet so someone smaller could stay safe. Here's the part of this story that tends to split a room, and maybe it'll split the comments too. Was Grant right to stay silent both times, protecting his daughter's stability over his own name? Or does silence like that just teach the wrong people that they can keep getting away with it? There's no clean answer. Grant himself never fully decided which side he was on. Brooke, for her part, had no idea any of this had happened. She had returned to work 3 days after Founders Evening with the specific, aching disorientation of a woman who remembered every second of a night she'd fully expected to have blacked out. The valet's refusal, the wrong turn Grant made, and quietly corrected without comment, the particular gentleness of being walked up 3 flights of stairs by someone who never once let his hand drift anywhere it shouldn't, the water glass. The note in handwriting slanted hard to the right. She had gone looking for him twice in the first week, first at the maintenance office, then, when told he was on leave, through HR, where a tight-lipped administrator informed her only that personnel matters were confidential and that Mr. Sullivan was no longer with the company as of Friday. Brooke had stood in that hallway for a long moment, aware, in a way she could not yet name or fully trust, that something had gone wrong that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with her, and that, whatever it was, it had happened in the exact blind spot where a company like hers quietly disposes of its inconvenient people while its CEO is busy running the numbers on a $41 million contract. 3 months would pass, and the contract crisis would only deepen, before Brooke Harrison finally sat alone in her office long enough, and quiet enough, to ask herself the question she had been too afraid to ask out loud. What exactly had Marcus Feld been so eager to make disappear? The crack began, as cracks so often do, with a number that didn't add up. It was a Thursday evening in late autumn, the retail contract now 6 weeks from its final signing deadline, when Brooke, reviewing quarterly maintenance logs as part of an unrelated cost-cutting review, noticed that the loading dock sensor recalibration Grant Sullivan had completed the week before Founders Evening had prevented an estimated $380,000 in potential inventory damage from a faulty conveyor alignment, a fact buried 3 layers deep in a facilities report nobody had ever flagged for her attention, filed under a technician's name she now recognized with a small, unpleasant jolt. She sat with that number for a long time. Then she pulled his personnel file, only to find it strangely thin, oddly generic, missing the kind of granular performance history a 2-year employee usually accumulates, as though someone had gone through it with careful, deliberate hands. It was Priya Anand, a sharp, soft-spoken data analyst, 2 levels below executive, who had quietly admired Grant's work from a distance for 2 years, and had never quite believed the vague explanation that circulated after his departure, who finally handed Brooke the piece that changed everything, an old, unlisted engineering credential search, run on a whim one slow afternoon, that connected the name Grant Sullivan to a 9-year-old structural failure case 2 states away, and to a signed report publicly available through a state licensing board archive, showing his original calculations had been correct, and that an unauthorized revision had been made to the file after his sign-off by another engineer, whose name, when Priya read it aloud to Brooke over a laptop screen in a nearly empty office at 7 at night, made Brooke go very still. Marcus Feld's name, 8 years younger at a different company, but unmistakably his. Brooke did not sleep much that night. What kept surfacing wasn't just the professional betrayal. A senior executive who had apparently orchestrated the quiet removal of the one man who could expose an old, buried failure. It was the private, personal shame underneath it, the recognition that the man Marcus had been so afraid of, the man her own company had discarded without a hearing, was the same man who had carried her up 3 flights of stairs on the worst, most exposed night she'd had in 6 years, and asked for nothing, not even a thank you, in return. She thought of her father, who used to say the measure of a company wasn't its balance sheet, but who it remembered when nobody was making it look good for the cameras. She had not remembered Grant Sullivan. She had let him disappear into a mailed severance check while she was consumed by a contract that, she realized with a fresh, cold clarity, Marcus had been quietly steering toward a vendor kickback structure that benefited exactly one person in that boardroom. She found Grant's address through payroll archives she technically wasn't supposed to access without HR sign-off, and drove there herself on a Saturday afternoon, alone, without an assistant, without a script, and stood on a modest front porch with a small bicycle leaned against the railing and a chalk hopscotch grid fading on the driveway, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could name, entirely unprotected by her own title. When Grant opened the door, Lucy peeking around his leg in socks with cartoon foxes on them, Brooke did not lead with an apology, because she understood, standing there, that an apology alone would sound like something she was doing for herself. Instead, she said simply that she knew what had happened both nights, the one in her apartment and the one 8 years earlier, in a state she'd never even had reason to think about before that week, and that she was there to ask, not offer, what he actually needed to consider this made right. Grant, standing in his own doorway, said the only thing he had wanted from any job in 8 years, not a title, not back pay, not an apology delivered for an audience, just the record corrected, quietly, permanently, so that the next person like him didn't have to spend a decade disappearing to protect someone smaller. It should have ended there, simply, cleanly, but the retail contract crisis chose that exact week to detonate. When the retail chain's legal team discovered irregularities in the vendor structure Marcus had quietly built, threatening to walk away from the deal entirely and take the 300 jobs with it, unless Harrison Regional could produce, within 30 days, verified engineering sign-off on the very warehouse systems Marcus had spent 2 years quietly mismanaging. 1 month would pass, the shortest and longest of Brooke Harrison's professional life, before the two crises, the old injustice and the new one, collided in a single room, in front of the one audience that had never once been allowed to see the truth. The 30 days gave Brooke exactly one option that didn't involve losing the contract and the 300 jobs riding on it, and it was an option she pursued not because it was strategic, though it was, but because it was the only honest one available to her. She asked Grant Sullivan, formally, on the record, to return to Harrison Regional Freight as an independent engineering consultant to verify and, where needed, correct the very warehouse systems Marcus Feld had spent 2 years quietly neglecting while claiming, in report after report, that everything was within tolerance. Grant took 2 days to decide, not because he doubted his own competence, but because he needed to know Lucy's schedule wouldn't suffer for it. And when Brooke, without being asked, offered him full remote flexibility and blocked out his hours around Lucy's school pickup before he'd even raised the subject, something in him recognized, for the first time in 9 years, an employer who saw the whole man instead of just the hours he could bill. What followed, over the next 11 days, was not a montage of triumphant speeches, but a slow, granular demonstration of exactly the kind of competence that had made Grant a senior engineer in the first place. He walked the warehouse floor at 6 in the morning before anyone else arrived, checking load distributions on the mezzanine racking system that Marcus's team had signed off on 18 months earlier without running a proper deflection test, identifying a torque discrepancy in 11 of the 42 support columns that, left uncorrected, would have failed the retail chain's own third-party safety audit and killed the deal outright. He didn't announce any of it. He filed a report, technical and specific, citing exact allowable stress values and the standard code sections Marcus's original sign-off had quietly ignored, and left it on Brooke's desk the way he'd once left a glass of water on a nightstand. Without asking for credit, without making it about himself. It was Priya, again, cross-referencing the corrected engineering report against Marcus's original sign-offs, who found the pattern that finally cornered him. Not one instance of negligence but 11, spread across 3 different projects over 2 years. Each one signed with Marcus's name, and each one bearing the same quiet mathematical shortcuts that had once cost Grant Sullivan his entire career 2 states away. When Brooke called Marcus into her office and set both files on the table between them, the 8-year-old altered report with Grant's original correct numbers beside it, and the new 11-column discrepancy report with Marcus's signature on every page, she watched a man who had spent a year perfecting the art of reasonable corporate language finally run out of phrases, his explanations collapsing from context to oversight, to eventually silence, the particular silence of someone who has just watched the last door close. Marcus Fell did not go quietly, not entirely. In his final week before the board formally terminated him, he attempted one last maneuver, quietly contacting 2 board members directly to suggest that Brooke's judgment had been compromised by a personal relationship with the consultant she'd just rehired, a smear calculated to cost her the very credibility she needed to close the retail contract in 6 days. For the first time in 6 years, Brooke did not manage the crisis alone in a stairwell. She called an emergency session with the full board herself, laid out the engineering findings without a single reference to anything personal, and let the numbers, 11 columns, 1 altered career, 1 saved contract, speak for a version of the truth that didn't need spin. The board voted to terminate Marcus that same afternoon, 5-1, the one dissenting vote coming from a director who had notably been the closest recipient of Marcus's vendor arrangement. Grant, watching all of this unfold from the careful distance he'd maintained throughout, in a modest conference room 3 floors below the boardroom, felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in 9 years. Not triumph, never triumph, just the quiet, unfamiliar sensation of a record finally, factually, correcting itself without him having to raise his voice to make it happen. 6 weeks would pass, through the final signing of the retail contract and the quiet dismantling of everything Marcus had built, before Brooke Harrison would finally say, out loud, the thing she had been circling since the morning she woke up in his daughter's guest room with a glass of water she never asked for. The retail contract closed on a Tuesday. $41 million and 300 jobs secured. And Harrison Regional Freight marked the occasion not with the kind of press event Marcus would have staged, but with a modest all-staff gathering in the same room where Founders Evening had been held 11 months earlier, except this time Brooke's toast named names, Priya Anand's for the analysis that had uncovered the truth, and Grant Sullivan's for engineering work she described, in front of 200 employees, as the reason the company still had a contract, a workforce, and, though she didn't say this part aloud to the room, a functioning conscience. She offered Grant, publicly, the title of Director of Structural Integrity, a corner office, a salary that would have solved every financial anxiety he'd carried since Danielle died. He declined the office. He declined the title too, at least the version with his name etched into a door plaque and his photo in a hallway. What he asked for instead, quietly after the room had mostly cleared, was that the company adopt a permanent, board-mandated third-party engineering review policy. One that made it structurally impossible for any single executive to quietly override a technician's sign-off ever again, so that whatever had happened to him twice in 2 different buildings over 9 years would have no room left to happen to the next quiet person who noticed something nobody wanted noticed. The quiet coda came 3 months later, on an ordinary Saturday, in Grant's backyard, where Brooke had been invited, not as a CEO and not as an executive making a gesture, but simply for dinner, the 3rd such dinner in as many months, each one a little less formal than the last. Lucy, now 8, had appointed herself in charge of teaching Brooke how to properly ride a bicycle without training wheels, a skill Brooke had somehow never learned as a child too busy being groomed for a company, and the 2 of them spent 20 minutes in the driveway, Brooke wobbling and laughing in a way none of her board members would have recognized, while Grant stood at the porch rail, arms crossed, watching, not saying much, the way he never said much, but smiling in a way Lucy noticed and later, that night, asked her father about directly, with the blunt clarity only a child manages. He didn't have a tidy answer for her. He just said Brooke made things feel a little less quiet in a good way, and Lucy, satisfied, went back to her hopscotch chalk. Later, after Lucy was asleep, Brooke sat with Grant on the same porch steps, the water glass long since a joke between them. She still kept the note he'd left her that first morning, folded in her wallet, handwriting slanted hard to the right, and told him what she'd never told anyone, not the board, not her therapist, not even her own late father in the years before he died. That the loneliest part of the last 6 years hadn't been the pressure or the grief. It had been how completely unseen she'd felt inside her own company, and that the first time in years anyone had actually seen her, fully, without an agenda attached to it, was a stranger who left before sunrise because his daughter had a school breakfast he refused to miss. That's really the heart of this whole story, isn't it? Not the contract, not the reveal, not even the justice, but the plain fact that the quietest people in a room are so often the ones actually holding it up, while everyone else is busy watching whoever's making the most noise. Grant never once raised his voice to get what was his. He never had to. The truth simply needed someone patient enough and honest enough to finally go looking for it. And Brooke, for all her polish and her pressure and her 9 years behind a wall she built to survive her father's death, turned out to be exactly that kind of person the moment she finally let herself be. So here's a question worth sitting with before you go. Has someone in your own life ever been quietly underestimated the way Grant was? Someone steady, someone who never made a fuss, who turned out to be worth far more than anyone around them ever bothered to notice. Tell us about them in the comments, even if it's only now, years later, that you're finally giving them the credit they always deserved. And if you believe the quiet ones are usually the ones worth watching most closely, consider staying part of this story with us. Subscribe, and we'll keep bringing you the overlooked people whose worth was always there, just waiting for someone to finally look.